I would say I am a speaker, researcher, and author specializing in the application of neuroscience to marketing and branding. And it turns out that the word Kitkat in that specific dialect of Japanese means something like, I wish you all the best. Why it spiked in December is because that's when it was this huge exam period for college students. And so college students were giving each other Kit Kat bars as sort of signs of a testament to my sort of good wishes for you on the exam. We bought this rubber ducky for $3. Now that we created the story about it, how much is it going to go for now on this marketplace? And it was like, it went up like 300%. People were willing to pay like $300 for this rubber ducky that had this incredible story when they were able to pay $3 for it when it was just the product itself. And so brands are sort of incredible at sort of telling these stories and sort of infusing ordinary objects and ordinary products with a greater sense of sentimentality and a greater sense of meaning.
One thing no one knows about you.
In my job as an undergraduate, I was a professional birthday clown. And I would go to birthday parties dressed up as a clown and do sort of birthday tricks. It was one of those jobs you just sort of do during the college years to sort of get yourself through.
Hello, fellows. Welcome to the next episode of Jagged with Jasravi. Subscribe to my channel for conversations at the edge with thought leaders from the branding, marketing, and the business world. Conversations that ignite new ideas that have rough and sharp edges. Hello, Matt. Thrilled to have you on my show.
It's fantastic to be here, Jasravi. Really looking forward to our conversation.
Yay. Thank you. Matt, if I requested you to tweet your profile, what would you say?
I would say I am a speaker, researcher, and author specializing in the application of neuroscience to marketing and branding.
So there are two books for my audiences, I must tell. Branding That Means Business is the latest book, and Blind Sight, Marketing That Shapes Your Brains. So you can see the spectrum that's gonna get covered, dear audiences, and aren't we lucky today? So we are going to take from both, and so that, because the first one for me was very foundational, and then, the second one builds on those fundamentals further for how business gets impacted through branding. It's such an original way, Matt, that you've said it in your book, is that marketers are in the memory business. I leave it a little open here, and I want to understand what you meant by that.
So imagine being a consumer and imagine having the most amazing, tantalizing, original experience with a brand. It can be, let's say, for example, it's an experience within physical retail. So it's just an incredible layout. The customer service is amazing. It's like a beautiful museum, which seems personalized and highly curated. And so you have this amazing experience. And let's just say the moment that you walk out, it's instantly forgotten. And so both your value as a human being and sort of having that experience, the value you took away from that is gone. And the value from the standpoint of the marketer and the brand who constructed that incredible, original, captivating, compelling retail experience, that's gone. And so memory really is absolutely crucial to so much of what we do in marketing, whether it's physical retail experiences, whether it's an experience with a specific advertisement or a broader campaign or social media, whatever the case may be. If it doesn't leave an impression on the customer, if it doesn't leave an enduring memory, it ceases to be valuable at all. It's as if it never happened. And so thankfully, of course, we naturally remember things. There's a conversion between our moment-to-moment experiences and memory. So that's clear. But there's also a huge science as to what the brain prioritizes as it converts experiences into memories. And this is where I think marketers can really gain a lot from understanding the neuroscience of memory. So, for example, we know through now decades of neuroscience research that the brain sort of really highly prioritizes emotional material. And even when it's something ostensibly very sort of basic, you just have participants, look at lists of words, and one list is like, chair and cup and face and hair, just like very boring, very neutral. The other list is like fire and death and romance and all of these sort of heightened emotional words. And you bring the person back to the lab, 2 weeks later, and you have them try to remember specific words on each list, and they basically totally forgotten everything that was on the boring list. But they remember actually most things that was on the emotional list. And so emotion is one of those sort of flags that the brain sort of waves and says, hey, this really caused a sort of uptick in my emotional experience. Therefore, it's likely worth it to remember it. So you don't remember that boring oatmeal you ate, 3 Tuesdays ago, because of course that didn't have an impact on your life. You're going to remember the time 3 weeks ago that a lion, chased you out of the zoo, or whatever the case may be. Either good emotions or bad emotions. If it's emotional, it likely serves an important role in your life. So it's a negative experience, you want to try to avoid similar experiences. If it's a very positive experience, you want to put yourself in a situation to have a similar set of positive emotions in the future. So emotion is one of many tools that marketers have, not just to create incredible moment-to-moment experiences, but also, again, to create enduring impressions in the mind of the consumer. There's also musical memory, which, again, we know from now decades of neuroscience that this has the sort of music is stored in a very distributed fashion across the brain, and as such, is one of the most enduring forms of memory that we have. We remember jingles from McDonald's or Kitkat or any number of brands that have used sort of specific sort of musical elements in their marketing, because again, music is heavily prioritized to the brain. And in the book Blindsight, we sort of give out sort of 4 or 5 or 6 different specific elements that are really sort of prioritized at the level of the brain and can really help marketers create amazing experiences that are also remembered to a much higher degree as well.
So like they say, the emotions are the indicators for a human being. So that's why I guess the mind retrieves it, because this is useful information. What made me angry? What made me smile? And the other emotions. Like there are 9 in India. We say 9 rasas. So there's fear. There's all of that. I'm sure. I mean, they must not be very different. That side of the world. So attention, friction, emotional arousal, and like you said, there are many more elements, and that's amazing. And in that context, you again, it's a very, very it's a beautiful line in your book, in your second book, which kind of makes it so clear. That analogy, when you say a brand lies in consumers' mind, yes, we've been saying it and experts have been saying it. When you say a house needs to become a home, I mean, immediately it's a journey that you can visualize, that what did it take for you to own it, for you to identify with it, for you to customize it, and for you to have moments of experience in it. And yeah, that's your memory working, and your deeper imprints happening. So in context of brands, if you could take some examples and explain that how it happens, that there is a brand that comes into the picture, and slowly it becomes your brand.
Totally. So whereas Blindsight was sort of more written for the consumer, sort of to help us understand, all of us, sort of how brands and sort of marketing sort of works at the level of psychology and neuroscience. Branding That Means Business, the most recent book, was really written for the marketing practitioner, really written for the brand professional, to really help them rise to the challenges of the modern business environment. And in the book, we introduced this concept of brand meaning. which I think is the most important sort of aspirational goal of any brand, is really to be endeared at a deep emotional level into the minds and lives of their target markets. It's not just another brand, not just another product, but it becomes to symbolize something important. It adds sort of density and depth to the lives of consumers. And in doing this, we introduce this sort of analogy of architecture. And on the one hand, there's building a house. And if you build a house, you have the basic foundation, you have the walls, you have the structure, you have a basic blueprint. And at the end of the day, you have a house. It's a place to live, and it's a structure, and it protects you from the rain and the elements, etc. And then on the other hand, there's a home. And the difference between a house and a home is the same difference between a generic brand and a meaningful brand. So whereas a house is built on, it has a brand personality, it has a brand strategy, it has a brand image, it has purpose, like that's a house. And going sort of one step further, it builds this sort of sentimentality, again, between the brand and the consumer, that it's become sort of integrated into their lives. And it's, as you mentioned, sort of the sense of ownership. And most importantly for the consumer, they can see themselves in the brand. It's a brand sort of for them. And in this, the brand, in order to do this, can invite the consumer literally and figuratively into the brand, into the home, for them to sort of make it their own. And this brings us to this topic that is really at the forefront of the book, which is co-creation. This idea of sort of inviting consumers into this creation, this co-creation of meaning, this cultivation of meaning. This can be through sort of the personalization of individual products. It can be through sort of interacting with the brand. It can be very simple things, even on sort of social media, where there's some basic, simple content or conversations around the brand. This is really where consumers begin to sort of see themselves in the brand themselves, and sort of it becomes, again, sort of more endeared and much more integrated into their minds and lives.
In that context, Matt, this is so beautifully what you said. This co-creation. Why are many brands? First of all, do you think that many brands are not getting that right? And now in today's world, there is a limited role for advertising, but there is content, there are influencers, and there's so much fragmented media that you have to customize your message to every social media platform, etc., etc. What do marketers do that will help them get this right? Content creation and leveraging influencers to their advantage.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think this is one of the questions that really keeps brand managers up at night in 2022. If you go back, a couple decades, it was pretty easy for the brand manager to really be sort of the guardian of brand image. That, we in the back room, a team of executives, we've constructed this brand image, and then we bring in our marketing team, we buy some paid advertising, we buy some magazine space, we buy some TV ads, and we dictate the brand image. And it was a really sort of easy time essentially for brand building. Fast forward to 2022, and that's not really an option anymore. There are sort of very few sort of mass media channels in which a brand can just be sort of dictated to a massive audience. The media landscape has sort of fragmented, and we're all getting our news and our content from different stories. It's all mediated through these different channels as well. So it's not as if we can just have this blank canvas to sort of write about. If we put something out on Twitter, people can comment on it, they can hate it, they can take it out of context, they can misinterpret it willingly or unwillingly. So it's a very sort of messy, very fragmented landscape. And so I think there's sort of two reasons why brand managers should really lean into co-creation. So number one is it sort of takes the guesswork out of brand meaning and sort of the construction of the brand image. That typically, the brand internally, the company internally will have a hypothesis for how consumers should use the product and how they should perceive the brand. But all of this is guesswork, and they don't really know. This is just sort of an idea that they have, and they throw it out there, and they get some feedback, and they adjust, but it's a very long process. In the process of co-creation, it really sort of takes the guesswork out of it, where instead of sort of guessing how you're going to use the product, guessing how the brand is going to be interpreted and how it's going to be sort of perceived. You essentially do that exercise with the consumers in real time, in a transparent way in which all the content that's coming in is being sort of user generated, but also sort of filtered and sort of curated through the lens of the brand. So this brings us to this sort of bigger topic of user generated content, which is a sort of a double-edged sword when it comes to brands. So on the one side, this scales incredibly well. So you could say, hey, followers, show me how you're using your Stan Smiths for Adidas. And it's all this, great user-generated content that comes out of it. And it's all this sort of free content and free advertising. On the other hand, when we make a request like that, we don't know what we're going to get back as a standpoint of the social media manager. We're going to get some great pictures of Stan Smiths back. We're going to get some craziness back. We're going to get some Nike fans coming in, talking about how these Nike shoes are better. You're going to get racism. All sorts of stuff is going to come back to us that it's sort of going to be against the sort of the intention of the brand, and can potentially, sort of damage the brand perception. Because again, gone are the days of sort of dictating brand image. It's much more messy and it's much more porous really now than ever before. So I think in the same for the brand, it's really about trying to guide this process, embracing a bit of ambiguity, trying to sort of enter the conversation and guide the conversation without trying to dictate the conversation. I think there's brands that do it really well. I think it just happened a few months ago. Spotify Wrapped is a fantastic example of it, where in any sort of digitally native platform, no two consumers are having the same experience. And most digital platforms, this is a really bad thing. So 80% of American households have Amazon Prime, but no two households have the same experience on Amazon. They use it and they buy different products, stream different types of movies. If you go on Netflix, everyone's watching different things. Spotify, they took that diversity and that sort of eccentricity of user experience, that lack of consistency, and they sort of turned that into a positive and say, look at the amazing diversity and the sheer sort of constellation of unique humanity that uses our platform, and here's this opportunity to sort of share our our quirkiness. And of course they do it in a way where it's very shareable. Every year there's sort of a new slightly different iteration on it. Sometimes it's a new color or an aura or what your music says about you. And sort of serendipitously, it leads to these sort of interesting connections between people. So you could be, having worked with a colleague for 5 years, you don't really know them that well, but you share your, Spotify Wrapped on, LinkedIn or on Twitter, and maybe you both like the same artists. You both like, some obscure esoteric artist that 90% of the world hasn't heard of, but now you're bonded by this shared interest. So I think it's an incredible way in which the sort of the core of the brand, which is a celebration of sort of human eccentricity, is sort of put into the hands of consumers. They sort of guide it, they take it, they run with it, and it needs a brand manager that's accepting of a bit of ambiguity to be able to pull this off and execute.
I feel like this is a mindset in itself, wherein you're just letting go, and you're like, okay, let's see what comes, and we'll pick up the good stuff and, like you said, curate it and build on it, and look at it as a window to consumers' life as well. Like the whole attitude to content is so different. Like you said, letting go of control, and then the co-creation happens, which is tough. Which is tough for marketers who have been part of a different world, to not control it at all. I mean, like to consciously not control it, because so that part. And this Spotify Wrap, how my son got this video, and he sent it to me. He showed it to me 2 times. He himself saw it so many times. My son was like over the moon, So how much you feel like in terms of evoking emotion, you feel special, you feel by that brand. So so much to gain from content, but how do marketers get this right? Also influencers, because sometimes it's just like, you've coached them, and I mean, how do you make that partnership seem natural and organic, and not a paid sponsorship, like even if the word is mentioned there, Because this is such a challenge. This is new territory. And I can tell you, Matt, even the best global brands in FMCG are not doing it. Even if they're talking to younger people, that mindset is not changed, because it requires a whole organization to put a complete different mechanism together. What would you say for them? What can they take, like 3 tips that they can start doing tomorrow?
Great question. I would say that it doesn't necessarily have to be all or nothing. So it's absolutely the case, as you mentioned, that brand managers are very nervous about sort of relinquishing control and just letting these conversations about the brands and letting brand image be a little bit spongy and porous. Very nervous about that prospect. And it's first to point out that of course, the brand can't lose complete control. So the brand, of course, is its own, sort of autonomous entity. It has its own identity. It has its own opinions. It has its own sort of decision making. It can't simply be an automaton sort of dangling from the strings of public sentiment. We do see that to a large extent when it comes to sometimes political stances that brands take, where it's a flavor of the month sort of social cause, and whatever the consumers want them to say, they'll say. And it really, in the end, reflects poorly on the brand, because you lose track of sort of who they are and what they stand for. So yes, there can be a little bit of flexibility and there can be opportunities for co-creation, but the brand also has to have its own assertiveness. And it has to have its own personhood. And so that's number one. And it's really about sort of finding a balance there. And the other thing I would say is that there's sort of great examples of brands, sort of storied brands that do have a heritage and do have a history of exerting this flexibility, because when they release a product in the world, when they release a new brand or new campaign, by definition, there's going to be something unexpected. And it's about what you do as a brand when that sort of unexpectedness comes up that really determines its success or not. And so one of the cases that we bring up in the book is Kitkat, which is owned by Nestle, and their experience in Japan. So long story long, Kitkat, for a very long time in Japan just had not been successful. You go back to the 90s and they're doing like, really, really low numbers, not very well known, low brand awareness. And they really sort of struggled to gain adoption. But their market research team didn't give up on the product. They examined, so, all right, is there any sort of source of life in Japan? Like any sort of niche consumers that are using it, any sort of, interesting scenarios? And they found that on this one specific island of Japan, during a specific time of the year, they just saw this huge spike in KitKat sales. And so they said, okay, interesting. What's going on here? It happens every year around December. And what's happening? So they investigated further, and it turns out that the word KitKat in that specific dialect of Japanese means something like "I wish you all the best." I won't give the Japanese because I'll totally butcher it. But if you translate it to Japanese, it means like, "These are my good intentions for you. I wish you all the best." And why it spiked in December is because that's when it was this huge exam period for college students. And so college students were giving each other KitKat bars as sort of signs of a testament to my sort of good wishes for you on the exam. And so they're like, okay, that's interesting. Can we do something with this? And so at the time, as most listeners will know, KitKat's whole sort of brand motto is take a break with KitKat. But the way they saw the product being used, it was the opposite. It wasn't take a break. It was like, here, you're going to do really well in this exam. Now go study for 12 hours and make us proud. And so they showed a bit of flexibility there. They said, okay, that's interesting. We're going to sort of lean into this. And we're not going to change our global brand motto, but in this, country, in this specific region, we're going to show some flexibility. And so what they did is they changed the sort of packaging away from their sort of standard red and brown to having pink, and to having rose petals and cherry blossoms, which in Japan is sort of a sign of good luck. And then ended up changing the motto and sort of take a break out of the ad copy and out of the product copy. And they just sort of let the product go. And it turned out that all over Japan, the sort of sales of TikTok experienced this sort of hockey stick growth. And over the next 10 years, they did campaigns which sort of deeper, sort of instantiated Kitkat as like the gift to give as people are going into exams. They experimented with different flavors and cultivated different tastes. And now to this day in 2022, 2023, still something like 80% of Japanese college students have a Kitkat bar that they received as a gift every single year. And so it was Nestle being sort of the good market research team that they are, listening to the consumers, understanding how the product was being used, which again was wildly different from how they wanted the product to be used, against sort of the brand positioning that they had envisioned in a back room of executives. They leaned into it, and to this day, Kitkat is very, very successful in Japan. So I think going back to your original question, it's really about sort of finding a balance. So Kitkat didn't sort of change their global brand and say, they didn't scrap, take a break. But for this specific region and this specific instances, they were flexible, listened to consumers, they co-created, and were very successful as a result.
So from a Kitkat, it became my Kitkat for people in Japan. So that whole house to home thing happened because they were listening, and that co-creation to the extent of what is this going to stand for, not just day-to-day content getting created, but the very essence and the very meaning they co-created actually. So that's
absolutely,
that's a brand. That's the power of a brand, more so when it's listening and ready to adapt, not leaving its core and identity. Yes. So, Matt, when you say our brains don't construct reality directly, instead, all all planners love this stuff, isn't it? This whole psychology, deep. So I'll say this again. Sorry, dear audience, for breaking. It was very, very interesting. So our brains don't construct reality directly. Instead, they construct a mental model of it. Beliefs are an important input to sculpting it. Of course, after this, we will have a branding question, but please explain this with an example, if possible. Yeah.
Totally. So one thing that we've sort of come to understand in perceptual neuroscience, which is one of the subdisciplines that I studied, is that we don't experience the world directly. We perhaps can't perceive the world directly. And what we experience, our phenomenology subjectively, in any given moment, is our brain's mental model. It's our brain's sort of estimation in terms of what it expects and what it understands to be the reality that we're experiencing. And our brains are pretty good at sort of being tethered to a shared reality, generally. But we also see instances in which the reality that we perceive internally may actually be very different and diverging from quote unquote sort of objective physical reality. And there's always this sort of gap. There's always this gap between sort of objective physical reality sort of out there externally and the internal subjective reality that we experience as individuals. And there's a lot of great examples of it. In Blindsight, we talk about some of the most profound examples being from taste, being from our gustatory sensation, which is one of our sort of weakest and most impressionable senses. So there's literally thousands of experiments which have been done, thousands of studies published, suggesting that when it comes to wine, for example, that our perception of the wine, our enjoyment of the wine is dictated, yes, to one extent by sort of the actual sensory input from the wine hitting our tongues, but from all sorts of things that have nothing to do with the wine itself. So for example, if you're told that a given wine is expensive, when it's really not, you will actually perceive the wine very differently. You'll enjoy it much more. If the same bottle of wine has more syllables on the label, or you're told it comes from a specific region of the world that has a strong reputation for that wine, you'll actually enjoy it much more. You'll enjoy the same bottle of wine if it's served to you in a crystal chalice as opposed to a styrofoam cup. These are all things that have nothing to do with the actual wine itself, but instead alter our mental model, alter our expectations, alter our ideas. And so again, ultimately what we experience is our brain's mental model and not the actual world the way it sort of objectively is. And again, this chasm, this gap, this is the marketer's playground. It really allows marketing teams and brands to really sculpt the raw experience of consumers directly.
So there are three facts associated with a product, and now how is the marketer going to link it to make this model or that model? And could we call this, Matt, isn't this also a brand story? What they say, the backstory, or I mean, like you said, it could be an origin story, or it could be experience related, story. But isn't this uh, giving a frame of reference to the consumer, situating a brand in a context which is known that, yes, the consumer will interpret it this manner. I mean, they will look at you more premium or popular or mass. So belief-based mental models can we say, are what people refer to as story, brand story, or is there a difference?
I think they're very close. They're very similar. So I think there's sort of belief-based mental models sort of generally about life, about our experiences in the world, and the objects that we take into account and enjoy. And then there's sort of the influence of the story, and brands have an incredible ability to tell that story. And when the brand story is involved, really we're very sensitive to sort of the hidden essence of the product. We're very sensitive to sort of the hidden essence of the object. This is the great work of Paul Bloom, who's now at the University of Toronto. He was formerly at Yale, where he's shown that we're sort of very sensitive to the sort of perceived soul of an object. We've done these great experiments with young children where he'll have your specific like sentimental teddy bear, and it'll tell them, hey, we have like a replication machine, and we'll put your sentimental teddy bear in the replication machine, and it'll be an exact replica, atom for atom, hair for hair, detail for detail. And which one do you want? And like every child, with no exception, like picks the original sentimental one. And what's the physical difference between the sentimental one and the non-sentimental one? It's nothing. But the sentimental one, we perceive it as sort of having a soul. We perceive it as having this sort of deeper essence that, again, just like a human soul, it sort of supersedes its sort of physical constituent parts. And in the same way, brands can really tell that story. Brands can really create this sort of deeper sense of meaning and essence about their products. There was this great experiment which was done called the significant object study. And what they did is they bought all of these like pretty everyday items off of eBay, this online marketplace. And it was like a rubber ducky, a paper clip, a pencil, a pen. And then what they did is they hired a team of fiction writers, and they assigned each fiction writer to one of these objects. And they're like, tell me a fictional story about this rubber ducky. How did it come to be? How was it used? Tell me a story about people using it. They told like a 1,000-word, story about each of these objects. And they put that in the description of the product, and they put it back on eBay. And then they sort of looked at, all right, well, what we bought this rubber ducky for $3. Now that we created the story about it, how much is it going to go for now on this marketplace? And it was like, it went up like 300%. People were willing to pay like $300 for this rubber ducky that had this incredible story, when they were able to pay $3 for it when it was just the product itself. And so brands are sort of incredible at sort of telling these stories and sort of infusing ordinary objects and ordinary products with a greater sense of sentimentality and a greater sense of meaning.
What a beautiful example. What beautiful examples to explain this, the difference belief-based mental model can make. Because yes, it's half the times it's our own projection onto products that makes it meaningful. But then that's what human experience is about, isn't it?
Absolutely.
That's a lovely example. It'll stay with me. Thank you. So Matt, there is just so much. Of course, you know, how much more can we cover? Audiences, pick up the book. I'd say pick up both the books and get to the depth of it. Okay, I have one question which you have to answer quickly and briefly. But before that, there is something
Sure.
that I recently read. And I said, okay, I'm going to ask Matt about this because Byron Sharp recently wrote this article that the importance of behavioral economics is out of proportion in terms of how it's being talked about, and or it won't make any difference if the mental availability and the other aspect of availability isn't there, which is what his institute brought to the forefront. What would you say? Because I want you to go a little deeper than what a non-behavioral scientist would say is like, of course, I mean, it's once you make it available, only then the other things will take on a meaning. Because if I don't see it or if I don't know about it, how am I ever going to opt for it or choose it? For this, I'm making a little larger question for you to say that why is it that behavioral science has suddenly become so important?
That's a really good question. Yeah. No, I love it. So I think there's obviously been a huge, as you mentioned, sort of uptick in the popularity of behavioral economics, behavioral science. I think this is really owed to the sort of incredible success and the pioneering work of Dana Kahneman and Dan Ariely, who've not only done incredible research in these fields, but are also great sort of popularizers of science as well, and have written some incredible books, of course, with this. I think there's a lot to say about sort of the efficacy of behavioral science in the real world. I think there's a lot of good evidence that, especially at the margins, sort of all things being equal, that something like the endowment effect or something like loss aversion or inserts behavioral economics phenomena here is going to have a big difference. And that's, I think, unquestioned. I think where things get a little bit unclear is how these sort of stand up to these broader sort of economic forces, like when can endowment effect and giving a consumer an opportunity to try on the goods and feel a sense of ownership for it and engender psychological ownership, is that really going to nudge the consumer, quote unquote, nudge them, when that product is $10 more expensive than the competitor's product? So, how much effect size is it really going to have, especially in a real world scenario, especially given how price sensitive consumers are in inflationary times, especially considering, how sort of habit driven most consumers are, and whatever you do from a nudge standpoint, they're just going to default to whatever, item they usually pick up in the grocery store at that time of week, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the question is like really how it operates sort of at the margins, especially when compared against these bigger sort of economic forces. I think we owe behavioral economics, of course, a huge debt for this general realization that, of course, human beings, of course, markets aren't rational. We're not sort of homo economicus. We don't operate the way standard economic models would predict that we would. We're much more rational, and we can, a la Dan Ariely, operate in these very predictably irrational ways as well. But I think that realization has sort of unfolded. I think that's been assimilated into general practice, and that idea of sort of the rational consumer is, generally speaking, the last bastion of that is in sort of academic economics. But in terms of practice, in terms of advertising, in terms of marketing teams, in terms of sort of decision science and UX, I think those insights have at this point been safely sort of assimilated into the field. And so, again, there's been this conversation, but going back the last sort of year plus, like, is nudge dead? There was a very sort of provocative article written exactly on that, which purported to show at least that nudge interventions, just when analyzed through a meta-analysis, actually weren't very effective. I think that the sort of claims there were a bit overblown. And when you really dissect the details, there's lots of good evidence that, especially within certain contexts, and especially when sort of treated in isolation, that specific interventions do have a sort of big impact on consumer outcomes. So I think it's really interesting to see the fields evolve, because behavioral science, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, was this new shiny thing, and all these incredible pioneers and all these incredible practices. I think most of it has been assimilated sort of into the field, either systematically or intuitively from the general intuitions of creative teams and ad agencies. And so I think that the sort of evolution now is to sort of look not just at behavior, but about the predicates to that behavior. So we know that if we, change a few things on our user experience, that, it's going to result in more conversions. It's going to result in more add to cart, but we don't really know exactly why. And we certainly don't know exactly why for cohorts of consumers, or certainly not for individual consumers. And so I think sort of trying to understand the psychological predicates of behavior, not just behavior, is really the way the field is sort of starting to evolve there.
Predicates of behavior and not the behavior. Oh, by predicates of behavior, you mean like the things that, sorry, could you please?
Sure. Yeah. So we know, for example, that in any sort of, it's like user experience or any sort of, feature you could integrate into an advertisement, that maybe it's going to have X effect on a desired behavior, but we may not know why. So we have hypotheses as to why. We may have a behavioral scientific theory as to why. We don't really understand sort of the underlying psychological mechanisms for an aggregated set of consumers, or even for individual consumers, as to why and how and in what ways they sort of change this given behavior on this specific trial. So again, a lot of it is sort of theorized. We don't really have good insight into the actual sort of psychological mechanisms which are predicating those behaviors.
Yeah. Like you were saying, loss aversion. So if you realize that the language has been that you will miss out, and there are more people coming for it than otherwise, why. And the wonderful thing is that this applies across humanity, perhaps in different ways, which is even more interesting, that we human beings, there are these evolutionary instincts that will work no matter what. Awesome.
Definitely.
What
Oh, sorry. And just to add to that, if I may, so I think sort of the predicates are certainly one thing in terms of the full sort of psychological experience that precedes and contributes and generates that behavior. But we also sort of don't understand the broader sort of psychology and the broader sort of phenomenology around a given behavior. So take loss aversion as an example. So it's a very consistent and a very robust psychological finding. But we don't know, for example, in any given scenario, whether that sort of results in sort of positive brand reverence or negative brand reverence. We know that it has a sort of a short-term limited impact on the behavior, but we don't know what any of these sort of downstream effects of that are. So imagine, so think about this in terms of media, or like a call to action in a blog post. So it's like, hey, there's, I'm only taking 30 more subscribers this week, sign up today and, be the first one, or something like that, using like a loss frame and a call to action. So what we're going to know when we sort of analyze this behavior is sort of the behavior, which is, hey, this loss frame, which has a good theoretical foundation, resulted, when it's executed, had a given impact on behavior. We could look, year over year or year over month, or in comparison to some counterfactual, it had this impact on behavior. And that's where the analysis stops. We don't know what the downstream effects of that are. So maybe we're going to get more signups, but maybe the people that sign up, they don't like us anymore because they felt pressured. Like, this is all happening implicitly and unconsciously, but maybe they don't feel so warm about the newsletter anymore. Maybe they don't feel so engrossed in the reading or the content anymore, because somewhere in that decision-making apparatus of theirs, they felt a bit coerced into that decision. Again, they're not conscious of it. It wouldn't appear in a survey, but it may have some downstream effects. And I think that's, again, if we're looking sort of what the future of behavioral science may hold, I think it's sort of understanding the broader context and the broader phenomenology, and especially when it comes to sort of effects on the brand. So I think that's really, the direction it could take.
Wow, that's a new door altogether, or maybe a new wall. Yeah. Okay. I did it. I felt pressured, and I might not like you as a brand because I did what I might not have done otherwise. So, yeah. Okay. Interesting. So the brand.
Totally, totally. Yeah,
Very.
no, it's a big topic. It's a big topic, just Robbie. I think, yeah, now you've got me thinking. I mean, I think one of the big things as well. Sorry if I may, make another comment here.
Please. Yeah.
But I think some of the criticism that's come from behavioral science, I don't think it's actually a criticism. I think it's a little bit of a straw man, but nonetheless, it's this observation that if you look at individual behaviors, yes, of course, there's certain tactics that can be executed that's going to have a reliable impact on behavior, but all of this is taking place within a broader sort of cultural context. And it's really the cultural context that is going to have a much bigger impact on any sort of likelihood of a broad scale intervention or broad scale behavioral change. So what's going to result through a behavioral science framework is going to be a sort of change in individual behavior. But ultimately, what's happening in aggregate is a cultural change, it's a social change. And I think there is a lot of good science about social change, a lot of good science about cultural change. It's much more difficult to do, but it's a much sort of broader and much more sort of interdisciplinary set of frameworks than just sort of the application of sort of individual behavioral scientific phenomena to make an individual sort of change their behavior, or an aggregation of individuals sort of change their behavior. I think sort of the bigger question is how do we get cultures and sort of systems and sort of larger sort of social systems to sort of to change along with them as well.
Using behavioral science.
Yeah, using what I think is a broader conception of behavioral science, because I think behavioral science, as it's traditionally conceived of, is really about behavior at an individual level. I think an expanded conception of it, and some people operate like this. So again, it's a bit of a straw man to say that behavioral science doesn't appreciate large scale social systems, but I think it's not integrated enough as it possibly could be. Oh, no.
So, Matt, I shoot the question, you shoot an answer. If you take time to think or elaborate, then I shoot with a gun.
Oh, no.
Are you
ready?
Deal. Let's see how you do. Okay. Mother's best advice.
Don't go outside when it's raining without a jacket.
Alternate profession could have been
a music DJ.
What would you do on Mars for fun?
I would read. I would read a lot.
Okay. Okay. One thing no one knows about you.
In my job as an undergraduate, I was a professional birthday clown. And I would go to birthday parties dressed up as a clown and do sort of birthday tricks. It was one of those jobs you just sort of do during the college years to sort of get yourself through. So probably not many people know that about me who are listening in.
What would you like to tell your 18-year-old self?
Just to not completely give up on the dream of being a musical DJ, and to try and do that maybe a little bit more.
Oh, okay. I see that happening. A book you'd like to gift to all your friends, and it can't be your own book.
Very recently, I read the fantastic book by Majel Galfan about rule breakers and rule makers, about really looking at cultural dimensions, sort of understanding different cultures through this incredible theoretical framework that she's pioneered through her research, which is looking at cultures on this spectrum of sort of tightness and looseness, which is a description of how they adhere to social norms and the range of punishments which people exert over their fellow citizens when those social norms are violated. So I think it's an incredible way to sort of understand different cultures. I think people understand their own culture better, and they'll understand other cultures a bit better as well. She's very careful to say that there's no right culture. There's no it's good to be tight or it's good to be loose. It has different sort of downstream effects in terms of cultivation of innovation and human capital, and also creativity as well. And there's some trade-offs there. But yeah, it's a fantastic book that I think will allow anybody to sort of understand culture a bit more deeply.
Amazing. And it can be applied to corporate culture as well. And I mean, it can be really beneficial. Okay. What's your favorite childhood memory?
Going outside and having my jacket on Mom, if you're listening, and jumping in the puddles.
Yay! Mama knows better. Okay. If you were to devote the rest of your life to philanthropy, what cause would you choose?
So a lot of my research back in my PhD program was focused on children with autism and looking at the specific reasons from sort of a neuroscientific standpoint that they often do not acquire the same level of linguistic mastery as their typically developing peers. And it's a community that I've stayed in touch with and is still very important to me. And if I were to partake in some philanthropy, I'd really get much more involved in that community.
Okay. Okay. What is your greatest joy?
Greatest joy is seeing my 4-year-old happy.
Okay. How would you like strangers to remember you?
Good question. I think just in terms of someone who's very, very curious and has hopefully allowed them to see certain parts of the world in a different way.
What's a lesson that took you a long time to learn?
Self-discipline. I think that's very, very important, of sort of doing the things you don't want to do before you do the things that you do want to do.
Okay. What's one missed opportunity you wish you could have a second chance at? I think I know this, but yeah.
Going back in graduate school where me and some friends, we got tickets to go to Burning Man. And this was back in, I don't know, the early 2010s. And we were all going to go, except one of our friends wasn't able to get tickets, and we wanted to all go as a group. And so we ended up just not going. And it's always, been a little bit of regret. I think I might be a little bit too old to go now. And so I think that's one thing I wish I could sort of go back and just bite the bullet and do.
Thank you for sharing that. What's
Sure.
next? Matt, what's next?
So I do have some initial ideas for the third book, sort of revolving on our relationship to consumerism and some of the social topics that we spoke about. I just find this space sort of endlessly fascinating, and so talking with my agent about a few ideas there, and so writing is a big passion of mine. And while I'm in sort of the focus of mine is sort of talking about this newest book, Branding That Means Business, I'm also starting to sort of write the early pages for the next book as well.
Wow. So see, it was so interesting that even when you elaborated, I didn't shoot. So all the best for your new book. See, I already suspected. Am I not intuitive? I knew something's brewing up already.
Very intuitive.
Okay, Matt, I'd request you to share your online address, email, anything by which audiences can reach you, connect with you.
Absolutely. So the best place to find me is at my website, neuroscienceof.com. And there's a link to my blog there, link to my content information. I spend probably a bit too much time on social media. And so I can be found on LinkedIn at Matt Johnson is me, or on Twitter at the same handle at Matt Johnson is me. And more than happy to sort of continue the conversations here. And thank you, Just Ravi, so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure to chat with you.
Cool. Thank you so much. It was an honor. And I think everybody learned a lot. And it was great getting to know you. Thank you so much for coming over.
Thank you so much, Just Ravi. I know it's a difficult time of night over there. I see the pitch black night in the background, so all the more reason for people to check out Just Ravi's podcast and work. And it's been a great opportunity to chat with you.